It aims to tell a story of refugees as they are, which is as powerful, creative, beautiful, and equal human beings who have the ability to create an impact in their communities.
Welcome to the Young Changemakers podcast season 4. In this episodes, we will be talking to inspiring young people from all around the world to explore how they are making a positive change in their communities. This podcast is a global Changemakers production. To learn more about how you can also make a difference, visit our website global-changemakers.net. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to another episode of the Young Changemakers podcast. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Sara. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. I'm really nice to reconnect with you. And
I know.
Yeah. So you probably don't know this, but Andrew and I met in 2010 at the Global Changemakers Global Youth Summit in London. And it was wonderful to reconnect and just get to know what Andrew has been up to these days. How are you doing?
Likewise to you, Sarah. It's been awesome to reconnect with you and hear about the wonderful things you're doing. I'm doing good. Everything's good. Excited to talk with you, and also super wonderful to reminisce about that summit because Global Changemakers made a big difference in my life. So, yeah, super excited to chat with you.
That's really nice to hear. And perhaps we can start with the beginning of how you started as a change maker.
Yeah, I think so. I went to the summit in 2010 in November with you, as you know. I think that was a really big moment for me because a couple years prior, that was my first year of college. And a couple years prior was probably my first breakthrough moment of realizing I could make an impact in my community and realizing where my heart for others kind of where it lied. And so for me, it was in my high school. I had been like class president during my 4 years, and each of the years I was sort of really focused on within my high school activities, which was really important because it was bringing the class together across different, racial, ethnic, socioeconomic lines. It was really cool, and I'm really proud of it. But it was the senior year and this was my project coming into the Global Changemakers program. I created something called Ignite Peer Mentoring, which has continued and served schools across the country with its curriculum. But basically, I had went to a school that was doing well in terms of academics. It was a public school, but was known for like very strong academics. There were other schools in my hometown of Jacksonville that had failing kind of scores and weren't doing as well. And in my junior year, the school brought in some of those students who were predominantly from the lower income neighborhoods in our city and predominantly Black and brown students. And the kind of reaction at my school, at least from some folks, was surprisingly kind of not as inclusive and not as welcoming as what was in my head or what I expected. So I started a peer mentoring program the next year that brought together almost everyone in our senior class to volunteer their time to be mentors to the 9th grade class more broadly, including those students, because we felt like the big gap wasn't at all ability. So a lot of those students, I guess the one piece I missed is a lot of those students dropped out in the first year, something like 44%. And so the gap wasn't ability, it was just a lack of sense of belonging at the school. And so we wanted to create that belonging, not just for those students, but for everyone, so that anyone considering dropping out or feeling like they didn't belong got the clear message from day one that they belonged and that they could do well and that they had a friend in the senior class. And so that was kind of what started it. And I think it was the kind of through line for me was any person who is in a disadvantaged situation or isn't treated or portrayed equally, I wanted to make sure that they were, and I wanted to mobilize people across backgrounds to make sure that they were. And so it's been beautiful to see that program go into other schools, and Global Changemakers was super inspiring to give me the confidence and some funding to continue it.
That's amazing. And how did you make it happen in terms of you went away for college? Like how did you organize that project so that it could continue by its own?
Yeah, I think college was a helpful point. And so if anyone's listening who's like in university, I've spent a lot of time in school, so I can talk a lot about how to balance projects with school. But I remember I wasn't necessarily going to continue with Ignite aside from it being at my high school and maybe one or two others. but I wasn't going to keep developing it until I took a class that was called Social Entrepreneurship in Action with a professor named Tony Brown where I went to school at Duke. And he really encouraged me. Like again, I was class president in college, so I was sort of very in the
Very
campus.
active, yeah.
Yeah, and he was like, it seems like you have a passion for outside of school, like local community, and so let me encourage you to maybe push on that. And then we, through that class, developed a more concrete curriculum for Ignite, and then worked with a school in Durham, North Carolina, and then made the curriculum open source. And then basically one thing I realized is as I moved on to other things, there's always a way you can transition something that can make it last in its impact in some fashion. And so with Ignite, we put the curriculum online. We created a Google Drive where teachers and counselors could share resources like, letters to their administrators to petition to get the program going, adaptations to the curriculum, logos, that adapted to schools, things like that. And so, we've had, last I checked, well over 100 schools use the curriculum in some form. And different, sometimes it's 12th grade to 9th grade, sometimes it's middle school, but any kind of peer mentoring that encourages younger folks.
This is one of the themes that have been coming up in the podcast, and specifically in this season, is that sometimes some people believe that they need to be the center of whatever it is that they're doing. And then I see projects like this one, and you're like, okay, I started this project, but I want everyone to have access to it because it's the cause that it's important. And then let's make this available for everyone, and it doesn't need you to be in the forefront and still checking everything, but you can move on to other things. And then if the schools want to improve the curriculum, or perhaps since this started, well, quite a while ago, I'm starting to feel old, but but since this started a while ago, perhaps right now I don't know, cyberbullying is much more prevalent than back then, or there's other ways in which things are happening, and then they can actualize it and improve it. But that's on the people that want to implement the project in their own school. So I feel it's a brilliant way of creating something that can last forever, without you being there micromanaging every single detail. I think that's really.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and just the value of partnerships too, because even in my more recent work with DreamXAmerica, for example, which joins storytelling and economic impact to highlight and support immigrant and refugee and first-gen entrepreneurs, just that partnership theme is important because at first we were thinking, so we released our film streaming on PBS, and then that was kind of the launch of it. And then we wanted to do zero interest loans or some kind of investment platform for immigrant entrepreneurs, but we wanted to do it quickly because COVID-19 had really hurt immigrant and refugee entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs of color in the US and around the world. But we were focused on the US for DreamXAmerica. And so we ended up partnering with Kiva US, Kiva being the major nonprofit that focuses on micro lending through crowd lending. And that was probably the best decision we made, because rather than starting from scratch, we sort of saw an organization that was very effective at what they were doing. And we partnered with them, but they had gaps in terms of reaching immigrant and refugee entrepreneurs. So then we partnered with immigrant welcoming centers. And so, I think it's a very important point you made about not needing to be in the center and not needing to do everything. But actually, your time is better spent sometimes, and it's more in line with the mission to partner with people, especially on the front line, who are more in tune with the problems going on. So
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Because starting from scratch is incredibly hard. If you're talking about any project, to start from scratch is incredibly difficult. But if you build from what's already been done before, then you already have some resources saved. And if you partner with organizations that have enough experience and enough reach already, then you're going to be much more effective. And thank you so much for talking a little bit about DreamXAmerica. I think that is incredibly interesting. And is there anything you would like to sort of zoom into that particular experience? Because I know that there are a lot of people out there interested in this, and I can see a shift there into you becoming a little bit more interested in sort of social entrepreneurial skills and that mindset.
Yeah, I think My big lessons from DreamXAmerica, I think one, maybe specific to the topic, but I think there's so much, and this ties a little bit to the book as well, is there's so much power in supporting, even in a small way, low income, kind of disadvantaged communities on the ground. So immigrant and refugee and first gen entrepreneurs across the US had all small businesses, but especially kind of those groups really struggled during the pandemic because they didn't have often as much cash on hand to weather a storm like that in terms of revenue. And it was very little. Our loans are between $1,000 and $15,000. They're on average $7,000 or $8,000, and they're zero interest loans, but they've gone a very long way. About half of our entrepreneurs said that they may have or would have definitely had to close their businesses during the pandemic without the loan. 80% said they couldn't get one otherwise. And so just realizing, it's interesting having been at Stanford for the last couple of years in Silicon Valley, hearing the kinds of dollar figures being thrown out. But then in most communities in the world, just a little bit of infusion of funding, especially for small business owners, can make a huge difference. So I just found that to be really inspiring. And I also would say every application I receive, almost every single application, talks about the desire to help and serve their community, which I thought was incredibly inspiring because these are folks who see entrepreneurship as a way to serve others and create community.
And advance their whole community, not just their own families or their own livelihoods, but the whole community.
Exactly. I thought that was really beautiful and something that we should aspire to in the broader entrepreneurial ecosystem.
Yeah, and what you were mentioning before about how you think or someone would think, looking at, I don't know, any news from Silicon Valley, that if you give a person $1,000, that's like, I don't know, that's nothing. That is an experience that we've had at Global Changemakers because we provide funding for young changemakers. But if you think of it as this is the first person that will ever give you money for a project, for example, in the case of GCM, but in these loans, this is the first company that will lend you a hand and say, okay, I'll give you this money and then you're going to pay me back, right? But just the fact that it's zero loan, it already creates a huge impact. But it's the fact that someone sort of gives you the stamp of approval, and then if they do well, then they're going to get, well, either from us, we recommend our changemakers for other grant opportunities, or we write recommendation letters for them to study, or a lot of things. There's a lot of opportunities. So just those small loans or those small grants can also open a whole universe of opportunities that come afterwards. So I feel that is something that we're not reflecting about enough, and just disregarding those numbers being and you just mentioned a book, but the book is 25 Million Sparks. It would be very interesting if you talked a little bit about the book, what it is about, and how it's been like to write a book about refugees.
Sure, yeah. So it's called 25 Million Sparks, The Untold Story of Refugee Entrepreneurs. And it tells the story of 3 Syrian women entrepreneurs who live in the Za'atari refugee camp in Jordan, Esma, Melek, and Yasmina. Esma is a storyteller and social entrepreneur in the camp who brings kids to her trailer and tells stories with Syrian protagonists and tries to create an educational environment of encouragement and empowerment for the kids in the camp. Yasmina is a wedding dress shop and salon owner who has created moments of celebration for brides and grooms throughout the camp. And Melek is an artist who has created art that often is very beautiful, the most beautiful art I've ever seen. Not that I'm like an expert. Tells stories often about human rights and advancement of women and girls' rights. So those are the 3 women. It sort of follows their lives, and then it zooms out and tells the story of about 20 camps and cities around the world. And it aims to tell a story of refugees as they are, which is as powerful, creative, beautiful, and equal human beings who have the ability to create an impact in their communities. And then it kind of leads towards this conclusion, hopefully, to people that welcoming and investing in refugees is a moral imperative, and it's also an economic benefit significantly for countries. So it tells those stories and then zooms out to the broader issue.
I've spoken to people working in the refugee space, and a lot of them are refugees themselves, and they speak about this narrative that has gone through everywhere. Well, but mainly it has been a vision of refugees and even migrants in general, of
Mhm.
people that, they come, they take advantage of the country where they go to. They're not doing anything for the communities where they arrive. They're just taking away a lot of things, or they're like, oh no, we should feel sorry for them, it's too bad that this is happening. And what I see here is a completely different narrative, because you are telling a story of three women that are rock stars in whatever they're doing. And it definitely shifts that. And of course, there is a crisis. There are situations that are impactful and are really hard, but there's also an incredible hope. Before we started recording, you were talking about how you get asked a lot about entrepreneurs and refugees and how they can be great entrepreneurs, and perhaps you would like to
Mhm.
talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. And you said it exactly how I put it as well in terms of the media and often political portrayals of refugees. The way I kind of tend to put it is they're portrayed as victims or as villains. So
Hmm.
they're portrayed exactly like you said, as helpless, pitiful, only kind of in
Hmm.
need, can't contribute. And often the motivation for portraying them that way is to raise money for cause. So sometimes it's a good motivation, but it's quite dehumanizing.
It's not helping them in the long term, because of course you
Right.
can donate once or twice, or even there are people that commit to donate monthly to a specific cause, and that's something that helps. But
Mm.
what if we look at the problem in a whole different situation, as a whole system, and as a complex one?
Mhm.
But sorry, I interrupted you.
No, no, that's right. That's right. Yeah. And then the other side is kind of the villain side, which is more directly dehumanizing, which is, or equally as directly dehumanizing, but it's, they're
Hmm.
taking our jobs, they're going to commit crimes, they're going to destroy our culture. And
Hmm.
often as we saw under the Trump administration in the US, there's a bit of a rhetoric focused on countries with people of color, even more so than Trump's terminology of S-hole countries. I don't know if you saw that, but there was a bit of a, we don't want to welcome people from certain countries, which was quite damaging. Although I talk about a lot when I talk about the book is that it's actually really an apolitical issue. Both sides, I think, of the aisle in the US have not
Hmm.
done a good job of ramping up our involvement in welcoming refugees. And the same is true across countries throughout the world. And it's both, again, the moral thing to do and the economic thing to do. The US economy in a 10-year period, under a study by the federal government, showed that refugees contributed $63 billion in net fiscal
Wow.
impact. Then refugees are 1.5 to 2x more entrepreneurial than native born citizens. And so there's an easy economic argument as well. So it's sort of what I hope is that things like the book and other kind of storytelling can help people cut past the political cloud of
Hmm.
buzzwords and say, oh, okay, these are real human beings who deserve to be welcomed in, just period, because of who they are. And then, oh, by the way, we're also kind of foolish to not be welcoming them in because they're incredible people who can contribute so much to our lives and hire people here in the U.S. or in the U.K. or wherever you are. And to your question on why they're more entrepreneurial, there's many reasons, and it's pretty amazing because refugees and immigrants more broadly face a lot more barriers than the average
Hmm.
citizen, and so there's language barriers, there's access to capital, there's initial
Hmm.
capital. Often, refugees like Yasmin and Malik and Asma came to camps or to their new homes with very little, but a few trash bags of savings or things like that. There's lack of networks, and there's trauma also associated with
Hmm.
refugees having dealt with either losing their own limbs or being in significant pain because of injuries from blasts or other things in their hometown, or losing family members. Constantly having calls back home for the family members who stayed, wondering
Hmm.
what's going on. The kind of mental limbo of just am I going to be here for a long time? Is the camp going to exist? Is Syria going to be peaceful? Can I go back? Am I going to be resettled? So there's a lot of mental anguish as well.
Hmm.
But despite all of that, refugees have an immense amount of entrepreneurial spirit. Like I said, often 1.5 to 2x more entrepreneurial. They have revitalized cities across the world, and Utica, New York, in Egypt. There's a report recently on a few cities there that have been kind of turned around by Syrian refugees. And part of it is, number one, a resilience. So an ability to push through kind of any business obstacles. And that's partly because they push through much more significant personal obstacles. And so some of these kind of setbacks that might push away another entrepreneur are pretty much nothing for many refugee entrepreneurs. Another is tied to that, but it's a level of commitment. So Yasmina in the book sold all of her wedding jewelry when she was at the camp to start renting dresses and all that. So that was both the only really economically valuable and also very personal valuable belongings to her. And so for her, she was all in. She didn't have a second option, and she was doing
exactly. Don't have other choices.
Yeah, exactly. And so
it has to work.
Yeah, it has to work, and it's not like a lot of the folks, again, not to criticize Silicon Valley or anything, but a lot of the people who are celebrated in Fortune magazine or Forbes or whoever it is are often people who did have a backup option or maybe did have well saved up. We have a joke, at business school, we see the cases, and often it's somebody who had $1 million of their mom's or dad's money to start with. So this is as far from that as possible.
When they're like, I started 10 different startups and they all failed.
Right.
How are you gonna do 10 different startups and fail and still do the next one, the 11th one, right? That's because you have backup options. You still have credibility. You have resources. You have a network. You have people supporting you in some shape or form. Hi there. We hope you're enjoying the episode so far. At Global Changemakers, we support youth to create a positive change towards more inclusive, fair, and sustainable communities. We do this by providing skills development, capacity building, mentoring, and grants. Head to our website, global-changemakers.net, to join our programs and use our resources. Now on with the rest of the episode.
Exactly, right. And so just that level of commitment is very different. And then another one is cross-cultural insights. And so there's a few studies that have been published that show that when students tap into study abroad experiences, they end up creating better ventures. And this is probably very tied to global change makers as well. And there was a study of migrants that when they tap into their thoughts about their home country, they tend to create better ventures. And so a great example of this is someone I did an interview with recently, who I wrote about in the book, named Razan. She started a company called Yorkshire Dama Cheese in the UK. And she came from Syria after some blasts in her husband's office. He was okay, thankfully. But she was eminently qualified and couldn't get a job in the UK. And so she came up with this idea because she had seen this halloumi cheese in Syria being really popular. And then she saw the British milk being quite well-fitting for making that kind of cheese. And so she was able to come up with this kind of other way of looking at the resources in Britain that others maybe couldn't have seen. And now it's, with a very small loan, like we talked about, to £2,500 from the government, is able to create a business that makes over 100K pounds in revenue per year, won a lot of awards, and employs a lot of people. So that's another one. And then quickly, the other kind of reasons that they tend to be more entrepreneurial. One is actually not about them, but about society, is that they tend to not, like Razan, either they can't get a job because their qualifications aren't appropriately credited, or they feel the discrimination and then get kind of pushed out of their jobs or decide to not do it. Oh, the last one is empathy. So I mentioned it earlier, but all of the applicants I get for DreamXAmerica, and Esma is a good example, a great amount of empathy for the kids that she was doing the storytelling for. And so they often want to create a home in their new community and have a good sense of understanding of the customer because of that.
I also believe that they can be more creative because they just have to. You have to hustle, because what else are you going to do? You need to earn some money, so what are you going to do? And then you become an expert at it. And then there's the matter of then that creativity being channeled properly and supported so that you can thrive even more. And that's where this sort of initiatives come in and can help.
Right. Definitely.
The refugee crisis is real, is something that is very worrying in many ways, and it's not going away. This is not a problem that we can solve from one day to another. Not everyone is working on the topic. I am curious, what was your motivation, your inspiration behind getting into this particular topic, and then writing a whole book, meeting a lot of people, and yeah, and having this amazing project that now is a book.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think a lot of it was seeing that the so first I'll start by the book's title is 25 million sparks, because there were 25 million refugees in the world at the time of my beginning to write. Ended up being 26.4 by the time I sent the book to press, and now unfortunately it's over 30 million, because of the 6 million and counting refugees from the Ukraine. And so it's an issue that I think is it's the most refugees in the history of the world at one time. Over 200 million displaced now, which is also the most. And for me, in terms of inspiration, I just saw kind of the disconnect between all the, my parents being immigrants from Egypt, and all the other immigrants and refugees that I knew and had worked with. Their impact on their local communities was so beautiful and so positive and so amazing. And yet you see the media portrayals as not that, as victims or as villains. And then you start connecting the dots, and you see the percentage of Americans who said that they did not want to welcome Syrians in the United States, or only wanted to welcome Syrians who were not Muslim or only Christians, was over 50% at one point when I wrote the book. And so you start making the connection, saying, well, why do people think that way? It's because they maybe don't see the human story of it, and they just hear the rhetoric and the wrong-headed kind of perceptions. So for me, it was, how do we break through that and tell a story that's much more unifying and tells the real beauty that goes on. And particularly with Syria, the Za'atari camp is known to be really entrepreneurial. And particularly with Syria, it's been over 10 years, and very few times did the world really tap into this story. It got old very quickly, I think, and it's quite sad because half the country's displaced. You have women, children, and men just killed completely, left to their own devices, living in camps, living in host cities, where they're in limbo. And so I wanted to shine a light on that, but in a way that acknowledged clearly acknowledged the disaster and the pain and the fact that these folks had nothing to do with it, but then also talked about their ingenuity and creativity and hope, so that they're seen as real, powerful human beings and the heroes that they are.
It's interesting how you're saying, well, the story got old, but there are still people suffering because of it. And I feel the same thing happened with Afghanistan. And that story got killed really, really fast. Nobody is investigating more in that particular topic because now we have a crisis in Ukraine, right? So it's almost as if there's a hierarchy of who are we talking about and why. And I remember some of the GCMs when the crisis started in Ukraine, and some of the GCMs that are working and have been refugees and work in that space have said, let's work for all refugees. We should all be acknowledged, and we should be helping everyone, not some being left behind, because then a lot of things start to emerge in terms of, xenophobia, in terms of racism. So and in terms of the discrimination because of your religious backgrounds and so on. So I do feel that this is something that we cannot just say, oh no, that story is too old. We cannot, we don't want to talk about that anymore because the situation is real. And perhaps we could end with a little bit of the current situation for refugees. How do you see it, and how do you feel that young people that are listening can help or get more involved, or even, I feel that even learning more about the topic can help a lot?
Yeah, definitely. I think the first is, in terms of the situation, as I said, over 30 million refugees. Unfortunately, very, very few, less than 1%, are formally resettled. Part of why that is that only 30 countries partake in the refugee resettlement program, and none of them do enough. The U.S. has historically been a leader, but they lagged a lot recently, just coming back up a little bit. But so the first is the policy of welcoming refugees and accepting them into our countries. That's like the most critical thing because, the vast majority are living in limbo and not in a situation they should be. And the ones that are living in limbo or in general refugees, 80 to 85% are in developing countries, not or at least not high income countries. And so a lot of the high income countries need to do more to welcome refugees, to kind of do their fair share of that moral obligation that was kind of agreed upon after World War II. And so there's advocating kind of our national policies to welcome refugees. And then there's a more local kind of element of how do we integrate refugees. And so I think anyone listening, if you have an immigrant welcoming center or refugee resettlement center in your hometown or where you are, providing, if your company can provide resources, providing funding, providing support, providing housing for refugees, that's often an immediate need, providing loans or investment in refugee businesses. If there's certainly a local organization or a church or a mosque or a synagogue or a religious group that's doing that. And so tapping into that is really important. Anybody who works or has their own startup or company or works for a company, thinking about how do you do your part to welcome refugees. And so there are staffing agencies that can help with that, like Amplio Recruiting and others, but making sure that your process is welcoming of refugees and doesn't discriminate against them. And then there are the international organizations too. Save the Children Jordan was one that I worked very closely with through the book. And so they do great work in the camp. They helped, for example, Esma as a teacher for them. They help do programs that Malik shows her art at, and there's other organizations like the UNHCR that do work internationally. And Kiva, you can loan directly to refugees, filtering on. So that's another thing you can do. But yeah, a lot that can be done. I think starting locally is very helpful. And then finally, just on the point about storytelling, is pushing back against stories that don't tell a full story of refugees. I like to talk about, I was talking in Stanford recently, and it truly is no difference between you and me and somebody who is in Syria in the early stages of the war. It's just that the time and place you were born, you're in a more stable place. And so it would be like if we're had to flee to Mexico suddenly because there was a war and you had to go to a refugee camp, you put all your stuff in a truck, you didn't have a work permit, you didn't know where your family was. I mean, it's I try to talk about it in terms like that because there's no classes of people. It's just that that's what happened to them and they had no say in it. And so thinking about it like that, I think, is a good motivation to start helping people locally.
I think that changes everything because, well, here in Colombia, we did not have as many refugees from the Middle East, for example. Well, yes, a lot of decades ago, but at the moment, we're not receiving as many as other countries, or even people from Ukraine. We're not receiving as many, but we have a neighboring country that is Venezuela, and we have received a lot of Venezuelans. If that narrative was so easily changed from one to another, then how can we create a new one and do something that is positive for? And now we know that it will not only be positive for them as people and as families, but then for the community, because there's a lot that they give back in terms of, even in that economical aspect that you spoke about. So I think that is something to consider and something worth it to explore a little bit more. Andrew, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for your time, because I know because of the book launch and everything, you're super busy because of your studies and everything. As you said before, you've been in the academia for a very long time, but we really appreciate you taking the time to do this. I don't know if you want to send a final message for changemakers out there, or young people that want to do something or that want to get started in their change-making journey.
Sure, yeah. Thank you to you for all that you're doing. Global Changemakers, again, has had such an impact on me, both tactically and just inspiring me to think bigger about what I can do in the world. So thank you for this podcast and for all that you're doing and the team is doing. I think if I left folks with one message, it would be to just think about, if you're trying to figure out what you want to pursue, one thing I've always found helpful, Howard Thurman, who is kind of a mentor of Martin Luther King, has a quote: "Don't ask what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive, and go do it." Because what the world needs is more people who have come alive. I think there are different ways you can take that quote, but for me, I think about if my life is just kind of living at an emotional neutral level, what are the things every day that really make me come alive? Like, what are the things that, or topics or people or locations that kind of elevate my spirit in a way? And think about those as a starting point and those pictures and those moments. And I think that will help kind of pursue, you might not ever find like one passion that's like, oh, I was meant to do this. But I think you can tap into what you were meant to do, or one of the things you're meant to do, by listening to that signal inside of you. What are the things that make you come alive? And then just start creating and pursuing. And yeah, it'll be something worthwhile and something you'll look back at with pride.
Thank you for that beautiful message and for your time. And I think it's going to be really, really inspiring for young people out there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sara.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you want to reach out, you can contact us via email at info@global-changemakers.net. Send us your comments, questions, or suggestions. Join our global community of young changemakers on Instagram @GlobalChangemakers, Twitter @WeAreGCM, and Facebook. Remember to rate, review, subscribe, and support. To help us continue to inspire more young people, share this podcast on your social media or contribute with your donations. Find all the info and links in the comments below, and see you in the next episode.